Toward the end of 2025, protests began in Iran. What started as anger against the collapse of Iran's currency against the US dollar, along with the state of the country's economy as a whole, has evolved into what is starting to look like a full-blown revolution. The Iranian regime, led by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, is trying to crack down. The protesters aren't stopping, and they may be about to get some help. After threatening Iran's regime with action, the US is getting ready to finish Khamenei and his regime once and for all. Once it does, there's a small possibility that the US will turn its attention to Russian President Vladimir Putin next. US President Donald Trump has already made threats against the Iranian regime long before the possibility of US action in the country went from a vague notion to something that looks increasingly likely. Just last week, Trump proclaimed that Iran would get hit very hard if its regime cracked down on protesters with violence. Trump used the same radio interview in which he made these claims to downplay the deaths that had happened up to that point. The US president claimed that those deaths were the result of stampedes, though the BBC adds that he also claimed that Iran's government had been told very strongly that there would be repercussions should it cross the red line of violent crackdowns. On January 10th, The Independent reported that Trump has also said that the US will start shooting if Khamenei's regime attempts to stop Iran's protests by force. That warning came as the protests headed into their 13th day, by which point at least 62 protesters, along with several police officers, had died in the uprising. Still, the protests grew. The Independent says that Iranians had demonstrated in over 100 cities and towns by January 10th, most of them shouting anti-regime slogans. Trump believes that Khamenei's collapse is coming, and there's nothing that Iran's supreme leader can do to stop it. "There's so many people protesting," Trump proclaimed during a Fox News interview with Sean Hannity. "Nobody's ever seen anything like what's happening right now. But I've put Iran on notice that if they start shooting at them, these people are totally unarmed people and they love their country." The warnings were in place, but it looks like Iran's regime hasn't listened. Far from backing down, Iran's leadership appears to have started the precise type of crackdown against which Trump and the US have warned. On January 11th, AP News reported that there had been a sharp spike in the death toll resulting from the budding revolution. The outlet says that at least 544 people are now feared dead, and that around 10,600 have been detained over the past 2 weeks. Those figures come from the human rights activists' news agency, which AP News says has typically been accurate in its reporting during similar periods of unrest. Of the 544 potentially dead, 496 are believed to be protesters, while 48 are members of Iranian security forces. Iran's regime claims that the second figure is much higher than is being reported. On the same day as the AP News report, Al Jazeera published a piece in which it claimed that over 100 security officers have been killed as protesters continue to openly defy the Khamenei regime. It's difficult to get more exact figures, and that's by the Khamenei regime's design. As AP News points out, internet connections have been shut down in many regions of Iran, along with phone lines being cut off. It seems that Iran's leaders are taking a page out of Putin's playbook. Russia shuts down internet connections and cell phone service in regions that Ukraine attacks with its long-range drones. Russia claims it does this to stop drone attacks. But Ukraine's drones hit their marks so often that perhaps doing this is more about minimizing the risk of evidence spreading onto the internet before Putin's cronies have the chance to try to control the narrative. Iran has borrowed the trick, but it doesn't seem to be working as well as Khamenei would like. Though the lack of internet and phone service has indeed helped Iran's regime obscure the numbers as it cracks down, evidence is seeping out of the country. AP News says that some Iranians are still managing to send videos out of the country, likely using Starlink satellite transmitters. Others are taking the opportunity to share these videos across social media, some of whom even ask for Trump to directly intervene. Emily Schrader is one example. On January 10th, she took to X to share a video, along with a message. "Dear President Trump, this is what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing to their own people. Thousands are being hurt, slaughtered by the regime. The time to act is now," Schrader wrote. The accompanying video appears to offer several examples of Iranian security officers firing on protesters, which is precisely what Trump warned them not to do. Iran has also become bullish. After appearing somewhat cowed by Trump's threats initially, Iran's regime has responded with threats of its own that suggest that it's going to handle the protests its way. According to The Guardian, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, has claimed that any US intervention will be met with force. In the event of an attack on Iran, both the occupied territory and all American military centers, bases, and ships in the region will be our legitimate targets. Iran's president Masoud Pezeshkian has also labeled those protesting as terrorists and has started painting his own picture of what's happening on Iran's streets. Families, I ask you, do not allow your young children to join the rioters and terrorists who behead people and kill others. Pezeshkian has also encouraged Iranians to take part in a national resistance march against the protests. It's not clear how serious Iran is about launching counterstrikes. It has done so before, as it attacked US forces at the Al Udeid air base in Qatar back in June, in the wake of America's Operation Midnight Hammer. However, that response was weak in comparison to what the US did to Iran to prompt it, and there's a chance that the US may now be sniffing at an opportunity for regime change that will benefit America and hurt Russia at the same time. Still, a hard line is being adopted by Iran, and the US is on the verge of responding, as you'll learn in a moment. First, the good news is for those who support the protesters is that all of the Iranian regime's threats, along with the growing death toll, seem to have done little to satiate the appetite for change. In its January 11th report, AP News notes that the protests are ongoing across the country, though it's unclear how effective they will be on their own. As the Kyiv Post wrote on the same day, there are limits to the amount of pressure that the protesters can exert on the Khamenei regime. For a start, the protests are fragmented, with no clear internal leader who can organize what is now a budding resistance into a true force capable of deposing Khamenei and his ilk. The Iranian regime's phone and internet shutdowns will also make it harder for the protesters to organize themselves, much less establish a leadership structure. More tellingly, there are yet to appear any signs that members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or IRGC or any of the standing regime's other security forces are on the verge of defecting. Yet. A lot could change very quickly if US bombs start flying. Also on January 11th, the Kyiv Post shared comments from several experts and news outlets, all of whom have differing opinions on whether regime change is on the cards and, if it is, whether the protesters can pull off that change on their own. For instance, Azadeh Kian, who is a sociologist, wrote in Le Monde that the messages of support being delivered to the protesters by the likes of the US and Israel might end up benefiting Khamenei's regime, as it could twist these messages into accusations of all opposition figures being agents of those countries. It's up to the Iranian people to bring about regime change, and it's only the convergence of the struggles for freedom of the different social, ethnic, and religious groups that can free Iran from the stranglehold of the regime, Kian writes. Others, such as Iranian political scientist Hamid Anayet, suggest that the protests are far more structured than they appear to be. Unlike previous uprisings, this one is far more structured. Resistance groups have managed to maintain the momentum of the movement across very different milieus, from bazaars and universities to provincial towns, Anayet says. However, other outlets have disputed this, such as the Polish publication Polityka, which suggests that the protests have no leaders and aren't on the scale of those seen in 2009. Plus, Iran's regime isn't cracking. It still stands defiant, even in the wake of US threats. However, that could be about to change. It appears that the threats Trump made about hitting Iran's regime hard if it started cracking down on protesters were far from idle. Signs are emerging that the US may be preparing to take action as the death toll rises and more evidence the regime is doing what Trump told it not to do emerges. And the biggest of those signs is that Trump has already been briefed on the options the US has if it decides to follow through on the president's threat. That's according to The Independent, which said on January 12th that Trump has already been briefed on several options available to him, including deploying cyber weapons, dispersing anti-government propaganda in Iran, sanctions, and perhaps, as a final resort, strikes against the Iranian regime. The nature of this briefing suggests that the Trump administration isn't rushing to drop bombs and may instead focus on stoking the flames of the protests. Still, strikes are apparently on the table, and as The Independent adds, Trump is also set to meet with various senior US officials to review the White House's options on January 13th. The wheels of the US military machine appear to have slowly started moving, and Trump's rhetoric suggests that he is all in on doing whatever he can to help the Iranian protesters. The US president suggested as much in a January 10th Truth Social post where he said, "Iran is looking at freedom, perhaps like never before. The USA stands ready to help." Trump even used 3 exclamation marks in that post, which we all know is a sign that he is serious. The Kyiv Post adds that some of the strike options being discussed include attacks on non-military sites in Iran's capital of Tehran, though the outlet adds that some senior officials are warning that unintended consequences could result if the US springs into action too quickly. However, the messaging out of the Trump administration and from Republican lawmakers seems to align with Trump's support for the protesters. On January 10th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio took to X to simply proclaim, "The United States supports the brave people of Iran." Senator Lindsey Graham, who is one of the co-authors of the bill that would lead to the implementation of secondary sanctions in the form of tariffs of up to 500% on nations that buy energy products from Russia, has also continued his stance of supporting those who rise up against America's enemies. To the Iranian people, your long nightmare is soon coming to a close. Your bravery and determination to end your oppression has been noticed by POTUS and all who love freedom, Graham said on X. When President Trump says make Iran great again, it means the protesters in Iran must prevail over the Ayatollah. How true this may be is up for debate, as Trump has made several threats without any action. But briefings are happening, meetings are scheduled, and there is now a distinct possibility that the US may take some form of military action in Iran. But will it? And if it does, what would a military strike against Iran's regime look like? The US has already provided an answer to the first question. We mentioned Operation Midnight Hammer earlier in the video, and that massive series of strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities shows us that the Trump administration certainly has the will to attack Iran. Trump is likely relying on this operation to bolster his threats. While he may not actually want to attack, not least because of the possible geopolitical blowback that might result, he's done it before and he can do it again, which is what he wants Iran's regime to know. By the way, you can learn more about Operation Midnight Hammer and how the US F-35s played a key role in our video. As for what the strike might look like, Forbes senior contributor Paul Idden has some ideas. In a January 11th piece, Idden notes that the US could choose to target Iran's government security forces, though this approach perhaps has the highest probability of leading to a retaliatory strike against the US military and diplomatic personnel in the Iran region. Targeting Khamenei directly may also not be an option, though Trump has in the past warned that our patience is wearing thin when it comes to Iran's supreme leader. Maybe that patience will wear out entirely if Khamenei continues the increasingly brutal crackdown that appears to be happening in Iran right now. Perhaps Reza Pahlavi holds the answer. The son of the last Shah, who was deposed back in 1979, Pahlavi has made it very clear that he wants to see the fall of Khamenei's regime, though it's unclear if he believes that fall will lead to him having an opportunity to take power himself. Our goal is no longer merely to come to the streets. The goal is to prepare for seizing the centers of cities and holding them, Pahlavi declared in a video address on January 10th, suggesting that he sees an opportunity for the fall of Khamenei in front of him. Assuming that Iran's protesters manage to take and hold cities, as Pahlavi advocates, therein may lie a route to US involvement. The protesters would need protection from the IRGC in such an event, and Idden argues that it's possible that the US may offer up supporting airstrikes. Here it's conceivable that supporting US airstrikes in the stringent enforcement of no-fly and no-drive zones around urban centers held by the protesters could give them a fighting chance, Idden writes. But even that approach has no guarantees. Trump's appetite for a protracted commitment to helping oversee long-term regime change in Iran is the big question. If that appetite doesn't exist, it's difficult to see precisely how the US will look to hit Iran hard, as Trump has claimed that the US will do. The New York Times notes in a January 10th report on the briefings that Trump has allegedly received that commanders in the region of Iran may also not yet see the best way to attack, should an attack be ordered. According to the outlet, one senior US official has stated that those regional commanders will want time to consolidate US options, likely to guard them against Iranian retaliation should Trump decide to follow through on his threats. Trump has form in that department. But Trump has flip-flopped on his threats and claims so many times that he could be worn on the average beachgoer's feet. But joking aside, there is another world leader besides Trump who is watching what is happening in Iran with great interest. That leader is Vladimir Putin, who has spent the Ukraine war cozying up to Iran's regime in return for missiles, drones, and ammunition. Putin knows that if Khamenei falls, those weapons may dry up, as may his influence in the Middle East region. There may also be a little voice in the back of his mind telling him that there may even be a slight chance that the US could turn its sights on him next. After all, Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro has fallen. The US seems to be threatening Ali Khamenei's regime right now. Could Trump be so buoyed by these successes, assuming Iran's protests bring about regime change, that he turns his sights toward a much bigger fish in the pond? It seems highly unlikely, especially as Russia presents a much greater threat to the US than the regimes in Iran or Venezuela, but maybe, just maybe, it could happen. After all, Trump is a man who sometimes seems only to respect those whom he views as strong, and Putin is looking anything but strong at the moment. And according to one man who has been in a position to understand US military action before, Trump may be eyeing up Putin as a man who is slowly losing his grip on power. That man is Alexander B. Gray, who is a former deputy assistant to the president and chief of staff at the White House National Security Council. Gray has a long history of working alongside or in the vicinity of US presidents, including having previously been a member of the 2016 presidential transition team at the US Department of State. And in a January 5th interview with the Times Radio's The Trump Report, Gray suggests that the Trump administration may not view Putin the way Russia's leader would want. "I think the way that the administration is thinking about it is that Russia is a power in decline," Gray says, noting that Russia has demographic, economic, and military problems that all sit on Putin's shoulders. Gray goes on to state that the Trump administration now may see Putin's Russia as a weak enough threat for Europe to handle, especially after defense spending has increased in a host of European states. Gray uses this point to suggest that the Trump administration may use Putin's weakness to withdraw its military support to an extent from Europe. In a January 10th article, the New York Times also explored why Putin suddenly went very quiet when the Trump administration captured Maduro from Venezuela. Russia's leader said nothing in the wake of Maduro's capture, suggesting that he may be very wary about getting on America's bad side. Mr. Putin has been careful to avoid antagonizing Washington as he seeks a favorable outcome in Ukraine, even if it means standing aside in other parts of the world where he might previously have played hardball, the outlet reports. Perhaps this silence is a signal to the Trump administration that Putin is weak enough to be targeted, or maybe Trump will be telling Ukraine to cede all of the Donbass again next week. You never quite know with the current US administration, and that's what worries Iran as much as Putin. Trump might follow through on his threats, he also might not. That unpredictability has become the US president's hallmark during his second term, and Putin will be hoping that the US doesn't start taking a closer look at Russia should Iran's regime fall. After all, things are already prickly between the US and Russia. Several of Putin's Shadow Fleet oil tankers have been detained by the US as they attempted to make their way into Venezuela in recent days, suggesting that the US isn't scared of letting Putin know that it has the power to stop him from doing what he wants. Find out what happened to Russia's tankers and what it all might mean for Putin in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the budding revolution in Iran. And thank you for watching.